So then, if you awaken from this illusion,
persistence of vision.
Hello, folks, and welcome to the Persistence of Vision podcast. We are here today again to talk about books, to talk about all kinds of stuff. I'm Lance Fever Myers.
And I'm LBDO.
If you want to know what we're all about, Persistence of Vision Publishing has a website. It is POV-Publishing.com. If you go there, you can see comics by Walt Holcomb, Shannon Wheeler, Penny Van Horn, a lot of really, really great stuff. There's poetry, there are essays. There's even a piece by LBDO up there if you want to read his words of genius. And speaking of LBDO's words of genius, he has a book coming out. You want to talk to the folks about that a little bit?
Yes. Can you imagine a book with a title like The Goddamn Fool? Well, you don't have to imagine. Just let it come into your doors of perception because it's coming soon. It's coming out in September, and I wrote it, and if you don't like it, you can bite it.
I do like it. I do happen to like it. And in the meantime, while you're waiting for that to come out, when is that coming out, by the way? When can we finally get our hands on such a copy?
We're having a book release party in the third weekend of September at Malvern Books. So, yeah.
Hell yeah. So in the meantime, as you wait, you can go to our website, which again is POV-Publishing.com, and order a copy of my book, which is called Why So Much? ? Author Lance Fever Myers, or just Lance Myers, if you will. Read that. It is beautiful. It is fantastic. It will be your next favorite book. Maybe your second favorite book next to the Illuminatus Trilogy, which is what we're going to discuss today. So who do we have with us here today?
We have the great David Moses Fruchter, worldwide authority on the Illuminatus Trilogy, and all-around beloved Austin figure, superstar, poet, writer, raconteur, frequent Dionysium contributor, and generally a devilish guy.
Well, thank you very much.
Welcome to the show, sir.
Hello.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Was that a reasonable introduction? Am I forgetting any of your major characteristics?
No, you got the devil in there, and I think that's what's important.
The devil is a liar.
That's what he wants you to think.
Yes, he's good that way. So tell us, David, how in the world did you wind up picking the Illuminatus Trilogy as your book to discuss?
Well, it is probably the book that I can speak on with the most authority and experience of any book in my life. I encountered the Illuminatus Trilogy at the tender age of 14. My mom had a friend who was a late-night DJ, and for my 14th birthday, he gave me two books, one of which was the poetry collection by Charles Bukowski entitled Playing the Piano Drunk Like a Percussion Instrument Until the Fingers Begin to Bleed a Bit. And the other one was the Illuminatus Trilogy, and which is if listeners don't know, it's a long, sprawling book, and to ensure that it captured the attention of a 14-year-old boy, he had dog-eared all the pages, which are a good number of pages that had really spicy sex scenes in them.
There are a lot of those, aren't there?
And so I was hooked, and it's been a formative volume for me, I think, from that point on throughout the rest of my life.
So you brought us a dirty book.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to do so.
Excellent. Now, the Illuminatus Trilogy is obviously there's a familiar word in there. Trilogy. No, not trilogy.
The
Illuminatus, which sounds like it should be the singular for Illuminati. Is that correct?
I think so. Yeah, I think there are a number of characters in the book who are Illuminati, and I suppose each one would be an Illuminatus.
Yes, and the cover of the book, if I remember correctly, has the classic U.S. seal pyramid with the eye on it. Now, I think everyone who's ever held a dollar bill and accidentally looked at the back has noticed that there's a very arcane symbol on the back of that dollar bill that does show a pyramid with an eye floating above it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's far from the only arcane thing about the design of the $1 bill. For example, another one, which is referenced in this book, is that the portrait of George Washington on the front of the $1 bill is thought by many to not be George Washington himself, but rather to be a defrocked Bavarian priest by the name of Adam Weishaupt, who was the founder of at least one particular branch of the Illuminati called the Ancient Illuminated Seers of Bavaria. The idea being that at some point he emigrated. He was contemporary with Washington, and the idea being that at some point he emigrated to the North American continent and, in fact, took Washington's place.
Now, when you say it is believed by many, you're actually referring to an incredibly small number of disturbed people who have no idea what they're talking about, are you not?
Well, it's difficult to say. I don't think there's anybody who really has a good bead on what many people or most people think. So
more now than ever.
Yeah.
Which brings up a good question, which would be, are the Illuminati real? Is any of this real? Is any of this based in fact?
Well, I think a lot of it is, but one of the key things about secret societies is that there's no way to know how much is real and how much is fabrication, how much is legendary, how much is deliberate misinformation. Certainly, if there are secret societies which are still somehow in power, it's very much in their interest to create these clouds of confusion, delusion, legendary about the things that they do. And their process of doing so is another large part of the Illuminatus Trilogy, is seeing these conspirators in action, deliberately clouding history and who might actually be responsible for what.
So the Freemasons would probably approve of this book. Is that what you're trying to tell us?
Well, Freemasonry is all through the book, as a matter of fact, and one of the connections between Weishaupt and Washington is that Washington, along with a number of the founding fathers, Jefferson and Franklin and others, were in fact high-level Freemasons. And the Ancient Illuminated Seers of Bavaria was, by at least some accounts, a schism off of Freemasonry. Certainly Weishaupt himself had been a Freemason, and then was no longer.
You know, my grandfather was in the Freemasons. I still have his Freemason ring.
Were there things that he refused to discuss about?
I never met the man, but my mom tells me that he would have meetings in his house that she was not allowed to be there for. So I don't know what was going on. That a child was ushered out of the room when everyone showed up to talk about the pyramid with the eye on top. But yeah, I don't know. I have no idea.
Well, that's how they like to keep it.
Well, we should probably clarify at this point that this is a novel. This is not a history of secret societies, although it deals with secret societies very extensively. But it does have characters. It does have stories.
Yes.
More than one
Many.
story, you might say. Yes.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the book in overview.
Well, it is a long and confusingly, certainly complexly structured novel that deals with people investigating ancient conspiracies like the Illuminati. And another thing that's sort of cloudy in the book is how far back some of these conspiracies go. Because one thing that genuinely has happened is a lot of organizations over time have sort of sprung up and then retrofitted their own history to claim a more ancient lineage than perhaps they actually possess in a continuous way. That happens a lot in the Illuminatus. There are any number of conflicting origin stories about the Illuminati and associated secret societies and organizations. On a character level, I would say it is the depiction on, in the cases of a number of different characters, of their progression through the process of letting go or beginning to question received wisdom, consensus reality, and to have their minds and eyes opened to the possibilities that there's more going on than they ever suspected, than most people would ever suspect. At the same time, it's a sort of a science fiction narrative. There are any number of fantastical elements, including talking dolphins, an ancient. I'm using that word a lot. This actually would predate ancient. An enormous sea creature that lives under the oceans that is named Leviathan, which is referenced in the Bible and other places. Hobbes uses it in one of his allegories. And it's also the title of the third volume of the Illuminatus Trilogy, Leviathan. There is an enormous golden submarine that is piloted by one of the most charismatic characters in the book, Hagbard Celine, who is a sort of pirate of the seas, libertarian, mind-opening prankster. It's certainly no one thing, this book. It's many, many things intertwined together, among which I think, literarily speaking, is a place that it carves for itself in a lineage that was pioneered by James Joyce. Robert Anton Wilson was a Joycean scholar among his other eruditions, and what I see in the Illuminatus Trilogy is a continuation of Joyce's work insofar as that the perspective from which the story is told changes over and over again between characters, much like in Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake. Time and place and point of view change, perhaps even within the space of a paragraph itself, without any particular clue or indication for the reader that that's happening, which I also see as quite Joycean. And also it's just dense with reference and erudition that most people are not going to get most of these references. And again, that's another, I think, fairly Joycean characteristic.
So you were mentioning characters. What about Saul Goodman?
Saul Goodman's one of my favorites. He is a police detective who is assigned to investigate a bombing of a kind of alternative news magazine. And in the course of investigating this bombing, he finds a series of memos that the editor of this magazine had assigned his research assistant to explore, that detail all of the different, or not all, but many of the different stories that are told about the origin of the Illuminati. And Saul Goodman undergoes his own kind of process and experience of having his world expanded, his mind open, achieving some kind of enlightenment or illumination.
So Vince Gilligan, you think he's a fan?
Vince Gilligan,
Breaking Bad guy. He's the guy who wrote the Saul Goodman character for Breaking Bad.
Oh, I
really?
I have not watched Breaking Bad.
This is for the Breaking Bad fans out there. I was surprised to hear the name Saul Goodman or see the name pop up in the Illuminatus Trilogy after having watched Breaking Bad, because in the series he references, okay, it's a made up name that he has, but he says it's like Saul Goodman. That kind of...
Oh, yeah.
That kind of, right?
Yeah.
So, LB and I were just discussing whether or not that particular phrase was popular in 1975. If that was...
I don't think it was. I don't think it was. But according to the, I think, rules of reality, as such as they are laid out in the Illuminatus, the direction of influence there could have gone either way.
That's right. It could have come from the present to the past.
Yes,
but it's
exactly.
it's great to talk about the time period when this book was published, because these authors... Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea. Mm-hmm. They have just gotten through the 60s and early 70s. So the influence of that time period is enormous, not only through the drug references and the references to expanding minds and things like that, but also we have to remember, and it's very different nowadays, but at that time there were societies running around. We might call some of them terrorist groups or underground movements, but at the time, there was an alphabet soup of organizations in practice, everything from the Symbionese Liberation Army, which kidnapped Patty Hearst, and no one knows what Symbionese means, and to the Weather Underground, to the Manson family, and a lot of these are referred to directly in the book.
Students for a Democratic Society.
Students for a Democratic Society.
The Yippies, which I think were very influential on Illuminatus in their prankster-ish way of sort of aesthetic terrorism.
Yes, and so the entire book, though, kind of takes that and then applies turbo to it, because they multiply the number of such societies by a factor of 100 at least.
Yeah, I have a little list here of some of the ones that are prominent in the book. There's the Justified Agents of Moo, who many years later became a kind of electronic dance music band. There's the Legion of Dynamic Discord, the Arisian Liberation Front, the Cult of the Black Mother, and then some ones that actually have existed. The Ordo Templi Orientis, the Ancient Illuminated Seers of Bavaria, the Argentum Astrum. Another historical figure who was very influential on Wilson, I think, and who, although he's not really referenced too much, I think also runs through the Illuminatus Trilogy, is Aleister Crowley, who was himself a mystic and a prankster and a secret society kind of person.
So all of these appear as playing cards in the game Illuminati. You ever played that game?
Oh yeah.
So I got the game, probably in 8th grade, I think, and we'd have our slumber parties and play Illuminati and Car Wars all night long. Steve Jackson games. I remember opening the package and sorting out the cards and finding this one mysterious card that had one word on it. It was Fnord.
Oh yes.
And I immediately felt completely discombobulated. I didn't know what was going on.
Well, Lance, I have like 5 things. I have like 5 things to respond to in what you just said. One of which is that when I moved here to Austin in 1994, I was delighted to find out that Steve Jackson Games, which was located here in Austin, also at that time was running an internet service provider called Illuminati Online, back in the dear old days of dial-up, and that was my first internet service provider. Here in Austin was IO.
And what is Fnord?
So Fnord is a concept that is not original to Illuminatus, but is developed a lot in Illuminatus. It actually comes from a little volume that we may want to discuss further called the Principia Discordia. But the idea is that everyone as a child, and this supposedly happens in public schools, is sort of hypnotized and indoctrinated to not consciously notice when they see instances of this word Fnord, F-N-O-R-D. And at the same time, they are conditioned to react to the subconscious perception of this word with fear and anxiety, a kind of a fight or flight reaction. The purpose of that being that Fnords are scattered all through newspapers and other media in the articles, so that as you're reading them, this kind of subconscious, unconscious tension is building up. The one place in these publications that you will find no Fnords is in the advertising, so that the advertising will be a soothing balm to this underlying anxiety. And like so many things in the Illuminatus Trilogy, this is a ridiculous and farcical idea that speaks to an underlying truth. I was thinking about this earlier today, how on Facebook, for example, you have posts by people and groups which are just a stream of various things to either be tense about, anxious about, angry about, or to envy, in the case of people who are sort of curating the best parts of their lives to present on Facebook. So you have all of that, which is is very neurosis producing. But then in between there, as a little relief, you have products, lots of products. So it's a very Fnordian system.
It is true that the ads tend to, with some exceptions, be more relaxing than a lot of the other content.
Right, and it's certainly no accident. And so the idea in the Illuminatus Trilogy is that once you have achieved a certain phase of enlightenment, or you've had your mind open, then you begin to see the Fnords.
And one of the most prevalent, if I'm remembering correctly, motifs in the book comes from a book we discussed, or a legend that we discussed in our very first episode of the Iliad, where we talk about the origin story of the Trojan War, where the goddess Eris basically starts all the trouble by throwing her golden apple into a banquet that is being held in honor of Thetis and her husband, who are going to give birth to Achilles. But the purpose of her golden apple is to create discord among the 3 main goddesses, and that leads to the beauty contest that is judged by Paris, which leads to Helen being awarded to Paris and
stolen away from
Menelaus, and
Yes.
the rest is a very bloody history.
Right. That golden apple has written on it the Greek word, and I'm probably mispronouncing this, Kalisti, which means to the prettiest one. Thus, the goddess is squabbling over who's the rightful possessor of that apple. That scene is also presented. That scene of the banquet is presented in the Illuminatus Trilogy. In that, though, it's a big sack of Acapulco gold.
Marijuana.
It's
yes.
a big and it sort of turns into a drug-fueled banquet. Yes, and that apple itself is very prominent in the iconography of Illuminatus. There's this symbol called the sacred cow, not cow like the animal, but cow as a single unit of chaos, CHAO. Probably not a real word, but what the sacred cow looks like is the yin and yang symbol, the Tao, but in place of the little dots of the opposite color, which you find in each of the twin paisleys of the Tao,
The yin and yang.
the yin yang, yes. In place of one of the dots, you have the golden apple, which you can tell has a little K on it, and in place of the other dot, it has a pentagon, representing the twin forces of order and disorder, which comprise all things by this conception, and are in constant cooperation and competition.
So the listener will have gathered by now that this is a fairly typical novel.
Yeah, it's pretty much your everyday, psychedelic mind spree.
Well, okay, so is it just that, though? Is it do you think that the main point of this book is just entertainment, or is there something deeper that we should be paying attention to here?
Oh, I don't. I would.
What are the
hardly
politics
say,
of the book?
Well, the politics are many and multivariate, like just about everything about the book. I don't think that you could say that it has a main point, except perhaps the main point of think for yourself and don't trust any perceived or received wisdom. If there was an underlying message, that would be it. But I think the authors would probably even decry that. Like, don't listen to us when we say think for yourself. They might say. It just does so many different things. So politically, there are characters who represent libertarianism, anarcho-socialism, leftism, and even bureaucracy as sort of political orientations. I think I would say, though, libertarianism in this book is it means a different thing now than it meant in the mid 70s. I think the capital L libertarian movement of today falls prey to a lot of things that are pretty harshly critiqued in the Illuminatus Trilogy. It's more of a lowercase L libertarianism, and one of those distinctions between the two perhaps might have to do with property. Among the many contradictions that Illuminatus presents is the idea that property. So here's a duality. On one hand, they say that property is theft. On another hand, they say that property is liberty. And that has to do with whether the rights to that property are enforced by a state or embraced by a consensus of free-thinking people.
Of course, it doesn't actually contradict. Those two phrases don't actually contradict each other, right? I mean, they seem to, because one makes it sound like property is a good thing and one makes it sound like a bad thing. But the idea that theft is liberty is not actually a contradiction.
Well,
especially when you have a character who is a pirate.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think that many times throughout the book, a seeming contradiction is shown to be a unity. I think that's an ongoing motif. This character, by the way, who is a pirate, Hagbard Celine, began his career as a lawyer defending the property rights of Native Americans. And he presents this idea to one of the chiefs of the tribes he's representing, this idea that property is theft, and the response from the Native American guy is, well, if the government takes our land, then property is theft. But if we get to keep it, property is not theft.
Yes.
So there's no thing, there's no idea or ideology or aphorism or anything of that nature that's presented in the Illuminatus without being undercut also at some point, which is one of the things I love about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's another great motif in the book, right, is that the most seemingly important and profound revealed truths in the book frequently turn out to be fairly obscene jokes.
And vice versa.
And vice versa, yes.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
So the word Illuminati, where does that start? Because I was trying to do a little bit of research on it, and looking up. Okay, so the secret societies that we're referring to, what are their origins, and where do these come from, and are they a good thing or a bad thing, and who belongs to them?
Well, all of that is clouded in mystery, and there's no solid answers to be found to any of those questions. One of the ideas presented in the book is that there are some secret societies that are sort of all about the enrichment and raising up of a few key members, and there's other secret societies that are fighting the first group that are more about the liberation of each individual. And then you might find out that both of those secret societies were actually being controlled by a third, more shadowy secret society with aims that we couldn't suspect. And as far as Illuminatus as a word, I think it's cognate with enlightenment and all of the various mystical and then by the time of the Enlightenment, more rationalist groups who use the metaphor of light coming in as a way to talk about their eyes being opened to a reality that they hadn't seen before. And so I think that's the central origin of the word Illuminatus. The Illuminati were the enlightened ones, the ones who could see.
Before we go to our lightning round, I'd like to ask you about a few books that seem to me to be part of the same ecosystem as the Illuminatus Trilogy. I'm thinking, of course, of, you mentioned James Joyce's Ulysses in particular, and Finnegan's Wake, but also the works of Thomas Pynchon, and especially
Absolutely.
Crying of Lot 49.
Yes, which it actually is referenced a number of times in Illuminatus in subtle ways.
And even Infinite Jest,
Yes.
and some others. I don't know. What do you think of as the relationship there?
I think it's very much in that tradition and lineage, and I think that if the publishers of the Illuminatus Trilogy had decided to publish it as a mainstream book instead of as a science fiction book, its place in our cultural history would be much more in line with the places of those other books. It would be elevated. All of those books have science fictional elements in it, but none of them, except for the Illuminatus, was published as science fiction. I think that if Infinite Jest, for example, had been published as science fiction, it clearly has many science fictional elements. I don't think that we would have a David Foster Wallace archive at the Harry Ransom Center. It was ghettoized in this way, and I think in that sense, it was doomed or maybe blessed to forever be an underground favorite.
It's also true that the authors would very conspicuously agree with you in that assessment and make a lot of references, do they not, to the fact that they are being ghettoized, even as they're writing the book.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that actually reminds me that one of the really fun things about this, if I can find it, there is a book reviewer within the Illuminatus named Epicene Wildblood, and he he reviews the book that you're actually holding in your hands reading, and he says this about it. "It's a dreadfully long monster of a book," Wildblood said pettishly, "and I certainly won't have time to read it, but I'm giving it a thorough skimming." The authors are utterly incompetent, no sense of style or structure at all. It starts out as a detective story, switches to science fiction, then goes off into the supernatural, and is full of the most detailed information of dozens of ghastly, boring subjects. And the time sequence is all out of order and a very pretentious imitation of Faulkner and Joyce. Worst yet, it has the most raunchy sex scenes thrown in just to make it sell, I'm sure, and the authors, who I'm never heard of, have the supreme bad taste to introduce real political figures into this mishmash and pretend to be exposing a real conspiracy. You can be sure I won't waste time reading the rubbish, but I'll have a perfectly devastating review ready for you by tomorrow.
Very good. That sounds like a great introduction to our lightning round.
Here it is.
Lightning round.
The questions that we put to all guests. We'll start with, what's the first time you fell in love with a book?
The first time I fell in love with a book was when I was a kid, probably 5 or 6. It was a book called Kenny's Window by Maurice Sendak. Very different than Sendak's work that he's best known for, like Where the Wild Things Are, In the Night Kitchen, which are these very saturated, colorful picture books for kids. The illustrations in Kenny's Window are spare, and there's a lot of white space on the page. And also, it's much longer. It has like 7 chapters. What happens in the book is that Kenny is having a dream, and in the dream, he's in this garden where half of the time it's day, half of the garden it's day all the time, and half of the garden it's night all the time. So, if you want to be awake, you just step over to the day half. If you want to take a nap, you just step over to the night half. He wants to stay there. There's a rooster with 4 feet there who says he can only stay if he answers 7 questions. And then he wakes up and he's distraught because he does not remember the questions. He doesn't know how to get back to the garden. But then under his pillow, he finds a crumpled up piece of paper that has the 7 questions on it. And so then the book goes through and he answers the 7 questions in turn. And much later, I found out that Sendak himself completely reviled that book. It was one of the first ones he published. He felt like it went on way too long. He didn't care for his illustrations in that one. But for me, I love that book so much. And to this day, it's one of my favorite books, Kenny's Window.
I find it's often the case that artists cannot be trusted to evaluate their own work at all.
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Okay, second question. Has a book ever changed your mind about anything?
Well, there was a book that changed. I think that in my conception, the mind is an ever-changing thing, and everything you perceive changes it. You know, it's an electrochemical matrix that's always in motion.
Answer the question.
So, but when I was listening to the other episodes of the podcast and I heard that question, I thought of a book that changed how my mind thought about minds, which is a book called Consciousness Explained by Daniel Dennett. And it presented to me this notion that there is no center to the self. There's no single thing that everything else about the mind is kind of some variation of. There's no essence to the mind. What instead you have modules of thought that are competing with one another in an almost natural selection kind of environment within your mind. And at any given time, some cluster of these modules is sort of dominant in controlling the body and kind of like presenting to the perception of your consciousness what they say is actually going on, but there's no center, and I found that to be a powerful idea, and one I still really enjoy entertaining.
Have you read Freedom Evolves?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I was hoping you could explain that one to me.
Who is it?
That's Daniel Dennett. That's also
okay.
Daniel Dennett. Yes.
That Daniel Dennett concept you're describing is definitely goes back to Leibniz to some extent, and of course is
the monads.
Also discussed in Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind. Very comparable idea.
Yeah, and I think also in the original notion of memetics, before it became just pictures with words, that Dawkins presented in The Selfish Gene.
Fantastic. Has a book ever changed your life?
Well, the Illuminatus, I think. Well, I've wondered whether it changed my life. It felt more at the time like it sort of pushed me in a direction that I was already heading in. I think that
That's what they want you to think.
yes, and I like to think what they want me to think. It feels good. I don't know that I have a particular volume that changed my life in particular, although there's a fantastic compendium of mythology called Mythology by British scholar Edith Hamilton that I was really into around the time that the Christianity of my youth was kind of losing its hold on my belief structure. Just the idea that, in fact, people all over the world had their own system of gods, and the God that you happen to believe in has more to do with where you were born than anything else, really pushed me to think that there's just no way then that any single one could be the one or the truth.
Fantastic. Has the book ever made you cry?
Oh, so many times. I love it so much when that happens. I feel like every time that a story or a song, any kind of artistic creation moves me to tears, it feels like such a gift to me. One that I'm thinking of right now is kind of a funny example. I've just recently finished reading a long, sprawling science fiction series called the Vorkosigan Saga by Lois McMaster-Bujold, which is it's a lot of different things. It's space opera, it's military science fiction, it's kind of soap opera-ish, but her drawing of the characters is so well-rounded and complicated, and the things that happen to them emotionally have such truth that I've found myself tearing up any number of times through it, which is not what you tend to think of when it comes to space opera, but it did it for me.
Fantastic. Name a book that you have read more than once.
When I was a kid, I used to reread almost every book that I read. I read multiple times, partially because it lived in small towns with small libraries. These days, I find that I don't reread books very often. One author that I do go back to the well on, though, frequently is my favorite author, Samuel Delaney. He's a science fiction writer, first came to prominence in the late 60s, early 70s. He's a black, gay, urban writer of science fiction, but also on a literary level, so complex and so many interesting ideas presented at such a rapid pace that every time I go back to his work, I see new things. One I've probably gone back to the most is called Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand.
Fantastic. Okay, here comes the $1 million question. Do you have any poetry committed to memory?
I do, in fact.
Fantastic. I love that answer.
A number of poems committed to memory. I was thinking when I was listening to Joe Hoppy's Iliad episode of POV here that, epic poetry was in the form that it was because poetry was easier to remember than a lot of other things, and pre the advent of the printing press and so on, it was the way that transgenerational cultural transmission happened. One interesting fact about the Homeric epics is that it's thought that at the time they also had distinct melodies that were associated with them, but the melodies have been lost to time.
Right.
The words stay on, but it made me think of how one thing they say about Emily Dickinson's poems is that they are suited to particular melodies. One I was thinking of is because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just us two and immortality. Immortality.
Beautiful.
But that's actually not the poem. That's not the poem that I want to. If I can be indulged,
Please. Yes.
I was recently privileged to hear the great San Antonio poet Naomi Shihab Nye give a talk on W.S. Merwin, who's one of my favorite poets, and it just reminded me of this Merwin poem that I have memorized called "Poem for Dorothy." Dorothy was the name of his first wife, and it's sort of a graveyard love story to my perception. It goes. No shape in darkness single stands, but we, in privacy and night, taking surprise of love for light, merged the dark fortunes of our hands. Patience of fire insists and warms through dust, through dusty bone the breath, the ear and intellect of death, direct of love the heated forms. Sitting on stones we kiss to please some stilled remembrance that shares our breath. Oh no.
We'll edit this part out.
Oh yes. Oh, there's 2 lines at the end.
We'll edit the pause out. Can you continue?
Yeah, let me try to start from the third stanza again.
Okay.
Sitting on stones we kiss to please some stilled remembrance that shares our breath. And then there's a line I don't remember, but the final line is, from ruin moving amends our peace, which I just see as kind of like a skeletal hand thrusting up from a grave, confronting these lovers. So I guess in answer to your question, almost. I almost have a poem memorized.
I'm suddenly reminded of a poem that comes from these Illuminatus books. Pretty little boydies playing in the toidies, which is described in the book as the essence of Zen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that's true.
Well, thank you, David Moses Fruchter. What a fantastic conversation. A very, very interesting book. And we'll have to have you back again because it was a delight. We want you, ladies and gentlemen, to come to POV-Publishing.com. We want you to buy Why So Much. The question mark is still free. And so you will buy that book. You will do it now. I want you to feel the soothing message of this advertisement and let it flow through you as a feeling of peace and absence of Fnords. Thank you so much. Lance Fever Myers, any final words?
Buy my book, and thank you, David.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.